Before we get started, I just thought this was interesting. What is, do you might know what this thing is, Mike? Maybe you can even Google it. It's like the Tomatina Festival. Have you seen this?
The tomato throwing festival, yeah.
Why does this exist? I mean, this is like really pretty crazy stuff. I mean, it's a lot of people that just, I mean, that is a huge amount of people. What's the appeal of this?
Well, they said it's fun at first, and then it quickly becomes really smelly. Like all the tomatoes start to kind of cook, and you're slipping and sliding everywhere. So I think it's fun for like 10 minutes, and then it becomes less fun.
Or like, I mean, you see like sometimes people like slipping into the mud and or like, you know, jumping
Yeah,
into something that's
yeah.
pretty, I just don't get the human appeal for this. Did you watch that that Netflix documentary on Woodstock 99?
No, I haven't yet. I heard it's really well done. I
It
heard
is
if anything, they're like
so awesome.
didn't like even cover some of the like worst parts of it.
Yeah, it's so awesome. And I guess look, I'm not quite that old, but I guess the original Woodstock, you know, there was a, you know, people were like jumping into like the mud and like celebrating like togetherness and stuff together. Here they had a muddy river, but it was created from all the sewage runoff from the toilets that didn't work. So it was literally like crap water, and people were just like jumping in and like, you know, sort of like this, but with something much worse. I just don't get why anyone would want to cover themselves in something that looks so incredibly uncomfortable. Does that look like fun to you?
I would rather do this than the running with the bulls. At least, you know, I'm not going to get gored.
I would rather do the running with the bulls because your odds of getting gored are very, very low, I think.
I mean, your odds of getting gored here are much lower. So.
Yeah, but your odds of extraordinary discomfort and questioning why you did this in the first place are basically 100%. So I don't know. People are weird. There's other ways to have fun, I think. Go to the beach. This is crazy. But one thing we wanted to start doing every webinar is celebrate a restaurant that is about to open or is recently open, just recently opened, that's, you know, special or unique or really worth celebrating for some reason. And Mike, you found this really interesting one. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, this is a really cool one, and it actually opens today. So if you're near UC Berkeley, you can go check it out today. But so it's called Cafe Alone, and so the Alone peoples are an indigenous group of tribes that live in Northern California. And so Cafe Alone actually existed at UC Berkeley previously as part of the bookstore that was on campus. And then the bookstore closed right before COVID. And so they kind of thought they were going to have to move off campus. But then actually the anthropology department had put in this really nice new kind of outdoor space, and they asked if they would put the cafe in the new space. So if anything, the new Cafe Alone is even cooler and nicer. So it, you know, reflects, you know, the traditions and the ingredients that Alone tribes would use. They do, on Wednesdays, there's a tea ceremony that they do. On Thursdays, they do kind of a lunch thing for students on campus. On Sundays, there's a brunch. But I think you have a few pictures of some of the dishes that they...
Let's look at the food. And while we do that, for all of you, you know, hit your chat button. Make sure you're selecting everyone that you're chatting to. And if you know of any interesting new restaurants near you, just share them with the community. Let's get the word out there. But Cafe Alone, let's look at some of the food they have. Well, I guess first they have this little background, right?
And they are, yeah. So, I mean, even when it opened the first time, they were the first indigenous restaurant in California. And that might still be the case, but they're definitely the only Alone restaurant in the world. So you are experiencing something that you really can't get anywhere else.
So what is the food?
So this is, actually, I think the pictures that you pulled this from are behind the paywall for me. But clearly, you know, this is a salmon dish, and there's a salad here. I know they use a lot of quail eggs, which you can see in the picture here. They were doing kind of a take on a tea smoked egg, but they were using quail eggs. They use a lot of acorns. So I think one of the first courses is like an acorn bisque or something like that. There's venison on the menu. I know there's oysters with like a gooseberry sauce. The next picture might be of the brownies. I think they were doing, I think this may be the brownies. I think this is acorn flour brownies on kind of a chia pudding.
That is chia, right?
Yeah, I think so. I believe so, yeah.
You know what I sometimes do? If you get hit with the paywall, you just hit escape super fast and hope you interrupt the web page before the paywall.
Yeah, there's a few, like I'll do reader view, and I'll do, you know, we need a lot of secondary research for Trendspotting. So we've gotten pretty good at it, but this one was being annoying. So.
Yeah, so if you're in the Bay Area, check this place out. I think it's it's literally a unique dining experience, right? You can't get this. I'm guessing not only can you not get this anywhere else in the country, I mean, there's probably not much of this in the whole world.
In the world, absolutely. No, definitely. And it's all outside. So the entire restaurant, they actually close down if there's inclement weather. So
very cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with today. We have we're honored with the presence of Mike and Ann today. The first part of today is really going to be around our 2023 industry forecast, which is going to be important if you're a seller or a participant in the food service industry in any ways. I would invite all of you to hit your chat right now. Make sure you choose all panelists and attendees or everyone. And I thought we can get things going in chat with just a question, which is, what is the greatest food-related movie or TV show? I think I actually had my own opinion on this, and I took it out of the deck because I'm like, I can't do it again. But
you did, really? That's shocking to me.
Yeah, I was instructed last time that we're doing it too much, so I'm gonna cut back a little bit. But I don't know, Mike, Ann, any thoughts? What is a fantastic food-related movie or TV show?
I mean, the one I think I've probably watched the most is, have you ever seen Babette's Feast?
Oh, what is that, like 90s maybe?
Yeah, I think so, like early 90s, I want to say. The food scenes in that film are just absolutely phenomenal to me. Big Night's also such a good one too. I can watch that over and over.
Ann?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the salty, sweet, acid. There's like that was a TV show, it wasn't a movie.
Oh,
but I really like
it was a Netflix thing, right?
Yeah. No, that like got me more excited to cook again than something than most other things I've watched recently. So
I take mine back. I think I've seen every episode at least 20 times of The Two Fat Ladies, a show that was on the BBC in the 90s.
What is that? What is that show?
It's called The Two Fat Ladies. It's if you can track down like YouTube episodes of it, it's literally these two British women, and they just travel all around the UK. And they cook these elaborate dinners, and they're just hilarious. Unfortunately, the two women who hosted the show have both passed away, but they're just absolutely the best, television cooking show hosts I've ever seen in my entire life.
Huh? All right, something to check out. Two Fat Ladies. All right, any other recommendations we're seeing? Scroll by in chat. I can't see the chat, so you guys are my eyes and ears.
Ooh, like Water for Chocolate, anything Jacques Pepin, Alton Brown. Ugly Delicious,
like a lot of Ratatouille at first, like
Soul Food. Somebody mentioned Paddington, so it wasn't.
So I don't have to.
You saying it, yeah.
Look, it's a pair of movies that are fantastic about a bear in pursuit of a marmalade sandwich, or that always keeps their marmalade sandwich. The coolest thing about Paddington is when something really offensive happens, he does his hard stare, which is Aunt Lucy taught him to do whenever someone forgot their manners. And it's the best. So anyways, let's keep going. All right, we have some brand new content in Report Pro. Obviously, this fantastic new plant-based report that's going to be a little bit of a shorter read, but gets you up and running on some of the latest things that are happening with the plant-based trend. A really great new report on economic indicators. So I think most of you have Report Pro. So go check it out. If you don't, ask your Datassential contact how to get access. We have a really fun report on food influencers. I think we've talked in this webinar a number of times about how one of the trends is that fads have become trends, essentially, that you have to be aware of the short-term stuff that we normally would have dismissed in years past because the market's reacting to a lot of short-term things. At that specific restaurant I was at in Atlanta, where the SWAT team came and locked us in with the active shooter, it was sort of like an upscale but semi-traditional Persian restaurant, but they also had corn ribs on their menu, which was originally a TikTok trend. So you're seeing a lot of these sort of social media derived trends show up in places you wouldn't really normally expect. And of course, this is what we covered this last session that we did a couple of weeks ago, but just as a reminder, our one table report, which is offered for free to the industry and just really a spectacular piece of work, is also available for anyone to download in Report Pro. It costs you nothing. And if you're a supplier into the industry, or if you're an operator in the industry, it really shares a great perspective on what's happening relative to labor, supply chain, and inflation, and what your strategy should be, how it should impact your marketing, your sales effort, and perhaps most importantly, what it means for innovation as well. Okay, so with that, we're really lucky to have Ann with us today. She's going to talk to us about our 2023 and beyond industry forecast for food service. How big is the industry going to get? Is it going to grow? At what rate? What does inflation look like? I think we just sort of jump into this, Ann, and maybe have a conversation around some of these really valuable stats that you've pulled. You'll actually see that we have an industry forecast report inside of Report Pro 2. So if you want a little more detail, we invite you to check that out. But to get started with this, I think we sort of have to understand what's happening in the macro environment. So before we jump into the specific numbers of, hey, this is where we think the industry is going to be, let's just maybe consider some of the macro things happening in the world, or at least in the US economy, and how that might impact what 2023 and beyond looks like. I wanted to kick things off here with a question for all of you. This one is a pretty simple one, and let's see what you all think. Are we headed to a recession? Are we already in one? Are we headed there? We're just not there yet, or do we not think we're headed there? I sort of have my guess as to how this poll is going to wind up. And any predictions as to what the split's going to look like between we're already in one, we're not there yet, but we're headed there, and no, we're not going to a recession?
Yeah, I think the headed there is like maybe 70%, and the other two are 15 each, would be my guess.
Oh, interesting. Like Mike, any guesses?
I would definitely say headed there is the most, but I would say very few people probably chose we're not heading towards a recession.
So my prediction, and look, this is like me cheating because I can actually see the numbers in real time too, but I promise you this was actually my prediction, was that we'd see 10 to 20% saying we're not headed toward a recession, and we'd see something like an even split with the other groups. And that's almost precisely, I'm going to end the poll right now, where we landed. 40% we're already in one, 40% we're headed there, and 20% no. So 20% of us are very optimistic, which is good. We need optimism in the world. Okay, so let's see what this actually means. Ann, you want to talk to us about just what the economy has been doing?
Yeah, no, and that, it's funny you did that poll, Jack, because that was sort of a trick question, I think, because technically we are in a recession, right? So recession, traditionally defined, is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. So if you're a by the book person, this is a recession. The last 2 quarters we have seen declining GDP compared to a year prior. But the story is a little more complicated. Why not everyone said that is a lot of economists aren't really viewing this as a recession. The full landscape, which we'll get into in a little bit with some other numbers, is definitely more complex than just this GDP, year over year change chart.
Yeah, and maybe we can just use this as a chance to sort of, foreshadow some of the upcoming numbers and how to interpret some of them. If we look at Q2 of 2020 and Q3 of 2020, you might look at this chart and say, hey, it's down 31, then up 34. So we had full recovery by the third quarter, but that's not how the numbers actually work mathematically, right? Can you maybe just sort of explain that to us a little bit?
Yeah, no, so it's based on, this is year over year, Jack. So it's based on the prior year. So it's a little different than when we get into our numbers. But it's much more complicated because when you shrink the pie, if you grow it again, off of a smaller base, it takes more growth to get there, basically.
Yep, very good. Okay, so 2008, we saw what happened. Here we are in 2022. Same, different? What do you think?
Yeah, so one of the things as we were sort of looking at this, obviously when we were putting together the numbers, it was all about recession. What's it going to look like? And for better or worse, my job was a little bit harder because it wasn't oh, let's just look at 2008 and it's going to happen again, right? It's going to be exactly the same. It's not. This is a very different landscape that we're looking at, right? What caused 2008 was sort of a internal failing of the financial system, subprime lending, housing crisis. It was real sort of like structural issues with the economy. And what we're seeing in 2022 is definitely a little bit different, right? We're seeing those COVID aftershocks, all the supply chain challenges, labor inflation. So it's definitely, different things that are driving this reduction in GDP that we're seeing. And as we get into the numbers, we'll see that, it means that the impact to food service is going to be really different. It's not going to be like a sort of traditional recession in terms of, everyone's cutting back, everyone's, trading down. It's going to be a little more complex and nuanced, we think, in the coming year or two.
Yeah. So unemployment is one of the numbers that you see reported about a lot. You just talk us through where we are and what this means historically.
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of the reasons why, the economists are saying we're not in a recession yet. I mean, obviously, if you look at where things were in 2008 versus now, I mean, obviously, unemployment's still quite low, right? So, people are out there getting work, they are bringing money in. So, that reduction we're seeing in GDP and spending, isn't because, people don't have income, right? It's maybe because they're picking and choosing where they spend their income. They're sort of starting to, save a little bit, maybe more for the future, right? So we're seeing, some definite changes in spending, but it's not because of these, high unemployment and people who are eager to work and can't get out there.
Yeah, and it's interesting the perspective of where things were back in like the late 2000s, right? And just how high that number actually was and how totally different than it is today. That said, right, unemployment is defined as the percentage of people in the labor force who are looking for work that weren't able to secure it. But there's another number to consider too, which is just how much of America is actually in the labor force. And again, to be in the labor force, you're either working or you're looking for work. If you just sort of said, hey, I'm going to check out completely, you're not considered to be part of the labor force. So this is labor force participation over time. And you can sort of see, we've had many, many years of decline. Leading up to COVID, we had a few years of stability where the labor force participation rate stayed roughly about flat. Then we had a massive drop off, in the immediate wake of COVID, and we've recovered a bit, but we're still not quite where we were in pre-COVID times. And if you sort of extrapolate this out, we have fewer people working today, despite a low unemployment rate. The labor force itself is just not what it used to be. I don't know, Annie, if you have any thoughts on what that means.
Yeah, I mean, it's fewer income earners, right? So that's, less money sort of pumping through the system. And that's, again, part of probably what's driving some of the decline we're seeing.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about too is it turns out, the stats you get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, whether it's unemployment or labor participation, I don't know if many people know this, but these are actually derived through a phone survey. They're the people. They have people that'll just call, citizens and ask them questions on the phone, similar as you might do like a market research survey via the phone. And here's some of the key questions that are asked in that survey. And if you look at question number 2, which is last week, did you do any work at all, either for pay or profit? If so, you're considered to be employed. And by definition, you're also considered to be part of the labor force. The thing that makes it sort of complex, and I think no one actually really knows how big of a thing this is the gig economy has gotten much, much larger in recent years, right? People driving for Uber or delivering Uber Eats or DoorDash or other types of gig work. That number continues to grow, but we don't really know the exact size of that. But that gig work technically would be counted as being part of employment or part of labor participation. So on the one hand, we see unemployment low, but you also see labor participation going down. A lot of that labor participation, despite it being down, the stuff that we still have left is probably gig work, and that number has been increasing over time. So I've never seen a stat where they sort of like adjust for all of this and say, well, this is how many hours are actually being worked a week or anything, with all that in mind. But there's probably an even larger effect of a smaller labor participation rate than we actually saw in the previous chart because of the rise in gig work. But I've still not, I don't know if, Annie, you ever come across it. I've not seen any reliable stat on that. So I think a lot of us are just sort of guessing at exactly what that number is. This is what employment looks like for the leisure and hospitality sector. What do we see here?
Yeah, we see, I think, what everyone probably on this call is pretty familiar with, right? Which is that, things tanked dramatically during COVID, and that we've made up a lot of ground, but aren't all the way back to those pre-COVID employment numbers that we saw in the industry.
Yeah, so leisure and hospitality includes food service, it includes other sectors of hospitality as well. But our number of employed people today in this broad sector is about where we were in like early 2016, right? So the 4 years, let's say, of growth that we saw from 2016 up to COVID is basically been, by today's standards, sort of eradicated. So we're at a lower level, and I think you really have to look at where leisure and hospitality, and more specifically food services and drinking places, are relative to the broader economy. So I mean, Anne, I'll let you speak first to this, and I might have a couple of thoughts and comments as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're sort of seeing where we're sort of struggling to get the same numbers of workers. I mean, it's, we all know it's not for lack of demand at this point, right? It's just, which jobs folks are flocking to, and we're seeing a lot of attempts by the industry to improve, labor or wages, I should say, and working conditions. But, we're just, we're not having enough people working in the industry right now.
Yeah, so if you look at the leisure and hospitality line over here, I mean, well, one, you have a number of sectors that have fully recovered or even at higher levels of employment than we saw pre-COVID, right? The numbers here are a comparison of where we are today, end of July, let's say, versus Feb of 2020. And a number of industries have fully recovered employment, and some are actually much higher than they were previously. Leisure and hospitality is still down 7%, and food, restaurants and drinking places are a subcomponent of leisure and hospitality, and there the number is about 635,000 jobs, lower than it was in Feb 2020. So in terms of people working, leisure, hospitality, and restaurants has been one of the slowest to recover segments. But we'll talk about some of the things that are happening that maybe sort of, addresses that or balances it out, or, makes it an advantage in some cases for if you're an operator. But we have to look at inflation as well. And what do we see here?
Yeah, so certainly we were coming up with the forecast. Inflation, sort of was a recession coming, and what was it going to look like? And then obviously inflation, a huge part of, figuring out the dollars and what that meant for consumer behavior. So, again, I think this is, everyone on this call is very well aware of what we've been seeing, major spikes up in inflation in the last few months. Food at home is right now at the highest, and away from home is a little bit lower, but the total food and beverage inflation numbers we're seeing, over 10%, are obviously, huge part of what's driving dollars for the industry right now.
Yeah, and wanted to just note a couple of things. So even though we saw, let's say, a slowdown in inflation in the last report for the month of July for the broader economy, we did not see that specifically as it relates to food. And Anne makes a really good point, which is that at-home food, the prices are spiking faster than away-from-home food are. But we actually have our own measure where we look at our menu trends data, and we look at every item on the menu, whereas I think the official government number on away-from-home food inflation is based on a basket of goods of some sort. But if you could look at more broadly at like every single thing on the menu, our number is actually a little bit lower. As of the end of April, we're at about 5.6%. I think the government number was 7.2 for that same time period. We talked about this on our last webinar. What it generally means is food costs are way up for the operator, but they're not fully passing that along to the consumer just yet. We're getting some very strong signs that they're going to have to if they want to survive in this environment, which sort of takes us to the next observation about what we think food away from home inflation is going to look like for the period ahead.
Yeah, no, exactly. So the sort of lighter gray numbers are reality, right? So that's the past. And then the sort of golden numbers are the ones that we've estimated going forward. And, we're, again, to sort of put together our numbers, we had to make a guess for where 2022 was going to end up and what we were going to see for 2023. And a lot of what we looked at to figure that out was looking at those at-home numbers, right, where price increases were passed on to consumers a little bit faster, we also looked at the producer price index, to Jack's point, like, certainly, folks that are selling to operators and operators on this call know that their prices have gone up much more than we're seeing for food away from home. And we think a lot of that's just because things haven't been passed on to the consumer yet. So, yet this year we're, expecting that food away from home inflation number to increase even further. And then through 2023, we'll finally start to come back down a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, if you're an operator, like you're scared to make things much more expensive. Like, oh my God, I'm going to lose all of my customers. But at some point you're like, I sort of have to do it. Or you realize that this is not just temporary and you got to bite the bullet. The one thing we saw in our one table work, which I think is pretty striking, is you had, I think, nearly 40%, if not more, of operators saying if prices continue going up for me, I'm just going to do an across the board increase of prices on my menu, like every item on my menu, not just little clusters of items, the way I would historically take a price increase. So that's a pretty dramatic turn, and it'll produce sort of the effects that I think, Anne, you've predicted over here. How about the size of food service overall? What does that look like?
Yeah. So if we get into the numbers, everyone's sort of eager to see, I'm sure. So we have, some consumer spend on prepared food and only includes non-alcoholic beverages. 2022, we're getting up to close to 800 billion. And then in 2023, it's going to jump up to 855 billion. And we time trended this so you can see kind of where we were pre-COVID, and then obviously that major dip in 2020, and then seeing some of that dollar growth as we kind of recover a little bit and move to our sort of new normal.
Yeah, and let's maybe break that down a little bit as to what those increases look like over time. Can we talk about what we saw in 2022?
Yeah, exactly. So obviously, as we just talked about, right, the dollars are increasing, right? But does it feel like growth? How much of that is sort of real growth, like real sort of volume movement and increases in the business? And you can see when we look at, 2021 to 2022, it's a combination, right? So certainly a lot of those dollars that increase over 2021 is simply due to inflation, right? That the same item is just costing more. There is some real growth in there too, as we're sort of continuing to recover from COVID, especially some of the segments that were a little slower to come back. We are seeing some real growth in 2022 over 2021. As we look ahead to 2023, you don't really see a real growth line there. We're thinking a lot of the dollars we're seeing increasing there are actually just going to be inflationary growth. So again, the dollars are going to be higher, but it's maybe not going to feel like real growth to most folks in the industry.
So just to recap, in 2022, most of the growth came from price increases versus volume. And in 2023, we think that volume will essentially be flat or maybe even down just a very, very small tick. But you'll still have dollar growth from price increases.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And how has this sort of looked over time? I mean, segment view, you definitely see, variance from one segment to the next.
Yeah, so this I know is like a ton of numbers to look at. So I'm sure you can all unpack this later. There's a ton in the report we have in Report Pro as well that dives into the segment specifics. But we've actually stripped out inflation here. So these are real growth numbers year over year. So again, we've pulled out that increase that's due to inflationary dollar growth. And you can see, obviously 2020, everyone was hit horribly hard, and we saw, a bunch of bounce back in 2021. And then as we look to sort of 2022, things are kind of evening out, calming down in terms of major bumps backward and forward, but we are seeing growth in most segments. 2023, things start to look a little more flat, some contraction in terms of real growth. So again, the dollars are going to be there, but in terms of sort of case volume or movement of items, there is some slight contraction with some variation by segment, I should say. So we'll sort of talk about it on the next slide, but we are going to see some segments doing better or worse than others.
Are there, just looking at these numbers, Anne, are there any sort of segments that sort of surprised you as, having bounced back faster or slower than we would have initially predicted, or do they all sort of fall in line with what your, early COVID forecast looked like?
There were a few surprises. There's certain things like hospitals was surprising to me. I feel like that was the big one that everyone's like, oh, COVID, hospitals are overrun. But it turns out, hospitals' businesses are pretty complex, and a lot of their business is visitors or events and, things like that actually bring in a lot of dollars for them. And, yes, patient feeding might be doing okay, but that's not really their money maker. And so, so they're sort of were more negatively hit. And then some of that business, hospital operators say is never going to come back, right? They're saving money by not, offering catered, events, and, their administration doesn't want to bring that back. So that one definitely surprised me a little bit.
Yeah, and if you look at the other numbers, I mean, hospitals sort of stood out for that reason. I think B&I is another one where we saw a big decline, a little bit of recovery, but we're not forecasting anytime soon that it's going to get anywhere near back to what its original level was. Can you maybe just comment on B&I?
Yeah, so B&I, so we look at B&I in two levels. We do separate sort of like white collar and blue collar. Blue collar's not fully back either, but is much closer to being back to sort of those pre-COVID levels. And I think all of us, a bunch of us are probably at home right now. And so white collar's just not seeing people coming back into offices. They've done some really cool pivots and some interesting stuff. A lot of places you can get your, food delivered to your desk. And, some of these workplaces really have, embraced the challenge and done some really cool things. But especially with a tight labor force, employers aren't going to force their workers to come back. And so, we've definitely just not seen that come back, and it's hard to imagine when that will happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a struggle for people to get back into the office. I know we've asked this question to this audience a few times in the past. I think most people say ideally they'd like to go into the office maybe 2 days a week or something like that. In reality, I think there's a whole lot of people doing like 0 days a week and have gotten so used to it that they plan on continuing doing 0 days. I mean, I don't know, for those of you in chat, number from 0 to 5, what's your preferred number of days in the office at this point in our COVID recovery? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a real mix. Yeah, 2 to 3. The first person to reply, all caps, never again. So,
Yeah.
there's some of us who just love the at-home life. And
That's a pretty strong feeling. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so where are we in 23 versus, let's say, our last normal year, which was 2019?
Yeah, and so this is sort of, this does include inflation. So, again, some of this growth is that inflationary growth. But it's definitely, part of why I bring this up is it's really going to impact the way, any sort of recession or cutback from consumers is going to be felt by the industry. Because what we're seeing is restaurants are basically, they're back in terms of dollars compared to pre-COVID, right? We've certainly seen that with some of the, earnings stuff earlier this year. People have been spending at restaurants. And what that means is, their cup is full again in some ways. We're sort of back to a new baseline, a new normal. And the downside of that is people sort of start to potentially cut back or sort of decide how they spend their money. They might be more poised to potentially see some contraction. Whereas on-site, as we just talked about with, B&I or hospitals, right, they kind of never fully came back. So, some of that business might potentially be lost for good. But also they still have some headway in front of them in terms of coming back from COVID, right? So, I think people will slowly come back into offices more. And, if we find that, there's some opening in the labor market, employers might require folks to come back in a little bit more again. So, in some ways they have a little more runway ahead of them. And so I think the recession certainly will impact some of those on-site segments as well, but we're not really starting from that pre-COVID level even. And in some ways that gives them, more flexibility. And I think most of those segments will be less impacted by a potential recession.
Yeah, and then talk to us about retail food service, and maybe help just define what that actually is for those not familiar with the term.
So we're basically just sort of looking at, the last regular year of spending versus 2023 spending.
No, I mean, Jack? Sorry, the retail food service. What actually is that?
Yes. Sorry, yeah. Retail food service is C-store prepared foods and supermarket prepared foods. So again, it's not the center aisle stuff or packaged goods. It's just food service items.
Yeah. So I got a question on the B&I thing, right? I mean, there are a lot of offices that are half empty or more than half empty right now. I think some of those companies thought that eventually it would get back to normal. Many are probably realizing that it won't get completely back to that. Are companies going to downsize their offices, or are they just going to continue to have the same size office and it's going to be pretty empty for forever? Like, what's going to happen? Is a lot of that, commercial real estate inventory going to turn into like condos and get converted into living spaces? It's weird, right? There's only so long that people can say, hey, I have an office for 1,000 people, only 50 people come per day, right? How long can you do that for? So
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe
it's
the-
definitely happening already. Yeah.
maybe they'll turn into food halls or something. Who knows? So I did want to say there are a lot of numbers behind this, and the numbers that Ann and our team here prepare in this forecast are actually published through IFMA, and I think many of you are IFMA member organizations, and IFMA is just a fantastic association. It's the International Foodservice Manufacturers Association, and they have a tool that we help build for them and populate called IFMA Scope, where you can actually go in and it's interactive. You can look at all the different segments. You can look at dozens of different metrics, and you can sort of customize your view. So if you haven't had a chance to go into IFMA Scope and use this thing that we call the operator landscape, I would strongly recommend that you do. You could print stuff out, you could download it to Excel as well. But if you want to know more about where segments are headed and IFMA and Datassential's view on on what's coming in the couple of years ahead, IFMA Scope is a fantastic tool. So definitely check it out if you have a chance to do so. And I think the other question is, what happened? I think the notion of a recession or something that feels like a recession sort of baked into your forecast already. And the question is, what sort of impact does this have on particular segments or types of operators or potentials for consumer behavior? But I think more importantly, what assumptions have we sort of formed in creating this forecast based on the notion of us being in something like a recession?
Yeah, no, exactly. So we have a bunch of sort of theories about what's going to be the next year or two of the industry. And one of them is, again, especially as we sort of looked at 2008 and how that recession looked and how 2022 is going to be different. One of the things we sort of one of our theories is that we'll see certainly some trading down, but also some trading up. So here's a stat here where we asked, QSR users whether they were going to go to QSRs more in the next year, and fine dining users whether they were going to go to fine dining more in the next year. And we see that fine dining users are more likely to be increasing their usage compared to QSR users. And so I think, we're going to see a lot of that in the industry where, yes, some people, instead of going to fast casual, will trade down to a QSR, or, instead of casual dining, they'll trade down to a supermarket prepared meal. But I think we're also going to see some of the opposite. So, instead of going out to a casual dining for that special birthday meal, maybe you splurge and go to fine dining, right? So I think we're going to kind of see more sort of spreading out of these changes consumers are making, and it's not going to be a pure trade down kind of scenario like we might have seen in past recessions.
Yeah, and it sort of makes sense, right? I mean, in the past, when we had unemployment, in the double digits, right? No matter where you are on the income spectrum, if you lose your job, your income goes to zero, you almost have to trade down. You have no budget. Here, we're talking about inflationary, things, and most people that want a job do have one. And this recession is going to impact people at one end of the income spectrum more so than others, right? So I think you will see some of that trading up, and places like fine dining might fare a lot better this time than they did in the past. How about technology? I think your theory here is, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so another one of our sort of predictions is that, those who invested in technology are going to do better coming, as we see a potential slowdown. There's sort of two main reasons for this, I think. One is obviously, reducing your costs, right? So, I think we have a couple of examples of, operators that are, adding in robots and things like that to save costs. And then the other side is, of course, reducing friction and improving the consumer experience. So yeah, here's an example of, Panda Express developing a robot walk, White Castle, again, having a, Flippy, the robot making their hamburgers. So again, things that, certainly were costly investments, but then I think, pay dividends as we kind of come into this new normal where we're trying to, potentially streamline our costs.
Yeah. And it's mostly chains that have been able to make these types of investments, right? So at least from a technology perspective, they should have a substantial advantage in the period ahead. And we saw earlier how, let's say, employment in leisure and hospitality, and more specifically in food service, is down. I think it's fair to assume that some of those jobs are now effectively replaced by technology. And those upfront capital investments that chains made in a lot of cases are going to start paying dividends because they'll find ways to just be more profitable year over year than places that don't have that technology in place. I mean, how does that seem reasonable to you? Or
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
and on the other side, loyalty. What are we seeing there?
Mhm. Yeah. So the other aspect, again, I think, employment's okay so far. People are still, spending money. They're just getting a little choosier with where they go and what that experience needs to be like. And I think another differentiator is going to be loyalty. So, again, we see, I think it's the next slide that has a bunch of headlines about, negative restaurant experiences. People are having a hard time, right? We saw the labor challenges that the industry has been facing. And so, we got to have these certain things that help differentiate one place from another so that, consumers will choose your establishment over others. And I think loyalty is one of those things that is going to kind of keep the traffic coming in the door, and it's going to be an important part of distinguishing the winners from the losers.
Yeah, so I think we started talking about this, I don't know, maybe a year ago or something when the labor thing really started to happen. I noticed when I'm like, hey, I went into like this fast food place and I see a whole bunch of teenagers working here all of a sudden. Like I haven't seen that in a long time. And I think we all experienced like, yeah, the service wasn't so great on this trip, or I went to a sit down restaurant and something seemed a little bit off. For sure, loyalty is important, and the ones that do a great job and maintain a great level of service are going to have a huge advantage. But we saw an interesting thing when we looked at, let's say, how consumers perceive delivery food, and that it used to be that consumers thought that pizza was a particularly good delivery food, and that other foods weren't so suitable for delivery. But with the explosion of third-party delivery, the thing that we found was, people have adjusted their expectations around what delivered food could be, and not necessarily in a good way. A lot of them just said, I expect it to not be so great, and I'm willing to accept that for reasons of convenience. Do you think if people have had enough, let's say, not so great experiences at restaurants, will they have calibrated their expectations as to what a good meal is? Will they be willing to accept in the long term a lower level of, let's say, service than they have, in pre-COVID times? Or is this a short-term thing, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that's sort of the trading up, trading down argument. Like I think, if we feel certain it's going to be a bad experience, I think we're either going to shift what that experience looks like, or forego it altogether. So I think, I don't think people are going to stay patient with that, right? Again, they're picking and choosing, and so if they can get an expensive filet mignon and make it at home, they might just do that instead of going out to a fine dining place if the experience isn't worth it.
I see a lot of chef videos where they, chefs say that filet mignon is the most overrated cut of meat. I don't know. I think it's pretty good. I like it. Anyways, the last thing that we think is important to note is, in a recession or something that feels like it, is that at the end of the day, we think innovation really does still win. I want to show you just a couple of stats. We've shown these types of stats before, but it's really worth looking at. This is taken from our Insider and Scores systems, those services. This is the percentage of all new chain menu introductions that are combo and value items, right? So, a new menu introduction could be anything. It could be a hamburger, it could be a salad, it could be a pasta, or it could be like a promotional combo meal or a value item. When we hit the financial crisis in early, by the time we got to early 2009, chains were jumping all over the value game, and 37% of everything that debuted in 1 month in the year 2009 were these combo meals and value items, right? Just squarely targeted at a value play. I think that did some damage, right? Because we sort of dropped the ball at innovation a little bit. And we focused strictly on the value equation. Luckily, we haven't quite gotten there yet. If you look at the numbers recently, deep into the second half of 2022, we haven't seen that same spike. So I think this is actually fairly positive that the industry hasn't shifted that. Now, I expect that over the course of the next few months, you'll probably start seeing that number go up, but I really hope it gets nowhere near those crazy levels that we saw in 2009. And the reason I wanted to highlight 2009 is you could sort of look at how menu innovation in 2009, at least at big chains, differed than what it looked like historically. So here's the percentage of all new menu introductions that are desserts or sandwiches or appetizers historically, and then you can see what happened in the year 2009. So of course you had, big increases for combo and value meals. You also had increases in things that tended to be sort of entree type items, but you had decreases in desserts and beverages, whether it's alcoholic or non-alcoholic, basically things like to help you actually add check average, and where a lot of innovation was desperately needed. The industry sort of moved away from something that would have actually been quite good for it because of this pursuit to value or going back to the basics with entrees. So I hope we don't do that going forward. My message just to all of you, whether you're a supplier to restaurants or you're an operator yourself, continue to do the innovation thing, right? You can do value a couple different ways. You can do like a packaged deal, hey, $1.99, that's a short-term fix, or you can actually innovate with value, right? Create value items that are still new and different in some ways, and this will support you better in the long run. And the last thought I want to leave you with is restaurants really only win versus at-home eating in one area, which is, taste and craveability. Like if you ask consumers, restaurants lose on convenience, they lose on health perception, they lose on affordability, but all that is obliterated by the fact that people like restaurants for the food and people to get stuff they can't get at home. When you ask people if you wanted to have different types of food for each one of these, if you're going to have it, did you want to have it, would you rather get it from home or away from home? The only place where people have a preference to get it from home is this thing that we call American food, and we're not even sure what that means anymore. For anything else, people prefer restaurants. We need to continue bringing these flavors and stuff onto our menus, even through a recession, if we want to, maintain the appeal that restaurants have and beat people, just trying to eat on their couch at home from food they got from home. So let's keep the innovation thing going. It's what's going to breathe life in the industry. So Mike is going to jump in now. You're not wearing the same shirt, Mike. You're wearing a different shirt today. Mike gave a really, really fantastic talk at the Flavor Experience Conference just a couple of weeks ago in San Diego. And we asked him to do a condensed version of it for you all today. So Mike, I'm going to shut up and let you take it away.
Sure, yeah. So that's from my main stage presentation at Flavor, which was on how to be weird and kind of, how to be more authentic. And but then my breakout session was on, bringing trends back from the dead. So how do you take trends that are dying or declining on menus or just maybe, a little bit old at this point and freshen them up and make them relevant again to consumers. So the actual session itself was a true ideation innovation session where I kind of presented, a longer version of this first part. And then we actually broke up into groups to do that ideation work and create some fresh dishes and concepts from all of this. And I'll share, what one team came up with at the end. Obviously, we don't have time on this, webinar to do that ideation, but I do hope, this kind of just inspires you to look at, maybe the products that you're making or the things that are on your menu in kind of a fresh new light and infuse them with new ideas. So if you go to the next slide, so I'm sure, if you know Datassential, you're familiar with our menu adoption cycle. So this is how we track trends through the 4 different stages of the menu adoption cycle. And so this is actually the map for Italian cuisine. So you can see things in inception are things that are very new, very exciting, very interesting to consumers. And then they move, if a trend does move through the menu adoption cycle, it goes to adoption, proliferation, and then finally to ubiquity. And the thing that we constantly get asked is, okay, then what? So it's moved to ubiquity. I mean, does it just die off? Is it there forever? What actually happens to a trend when it finally gets to that last stage of the menu adoption cycle? And there are a few things that do happen. So on the next slide, you can see, some trends. So then what? Just go if you go to the next one, actually, Jack. So some trends do die. There are some trends that they make it to the end of the menu adoption cycle, and for a multitude of reasons, they die off and essentially move back to the inception stage of the menu adoption cycle. So probably one of the best examples is aspic, or some of those meat jellies that were very popular, in the early 20th century. It wasn't unusual to see, on a dinner table in the 40s and 50s, tomato aspic or a tomato jelly on the table. And now this is something, I feel like every year there's like an article that comes out that's like aspic is back. But for, all intents and purposes, I mean, this is a trend that has pretty much died
I saw a TikTok video on this very morning. on a
About aspic coming back?
on a 1931 hamburger jelly recipe.
Oh, okay, sure.
That a mother made for her daughter to eat, and the daughter was not happy about it at all.
So some trends do die out. Some become classics. You know, they're in ubiquity. You know, pretty much by the time you made it to ubiquity, you've kind of proven yourself at that point. So it's things like chocolate chip cookies and pizzas and burgers. I mean, they're probably going to be in that ubiquity stage for a good long time. And they're just, you know, classics in the cuisine and kind of what we eat day in and day out. And then some things on the next slide here are disrupted. So, you know, there are some categories that need that freshening up, and there's a different, you know, alternative product that comes in and takes its place. Probably the best example right now is kind of all of the alternative dairy milks, where I know we've showed this data in the past, but when you look at what younger consumers are drinking, they are replacing drinking dairy milk with a lot of the oat milks and the almond milks and things like that. So it is building on a trend that existed, but it's disrupting it. So why should you be a trend reviver? You know, why should you be somebody in the industry that can look at these trends and kind of, you know, infuse them with new ideas? And there are a few reasons why. So one, you know, is just to keep things interesting. So by the time anything moves to ubiquity, it's everywhere. You know, consumers can find it everywhere. This is just, you know, some of the tacos that have been released on major chain menus this year. So I believe there have been, you know, when I did the presentation, it was something like 50 taco LTOs on major chain menus released this year so far. So we have a lot of tacos. Tacos are in ubiquity. And so if you want to stand out, you know, you're going to have to infuse a taco with some new ideas and some new flavors. It's also to disrupt yourself. So, you know, a lot of times what we hear from clients is, you know, we've been making something for a long time, and then all of a sudden this upstart company came in and they disrupted it, and we were really caught unaware by it. So, you know, one thing you always want to do is just constantly rethink your own product line or rethink your own menu, so that doesn't necessarily happen to you, you know, in the future. It's also just a way, you know, to keep things interesting, proven trends. So I think that's the thing, you know, we were just talking about. By the time you move to ubiquity, you are a proven trend. You know, consumers love you. You are those tacos, those burgers, those pizzas, those, you know, chocolate chip cookies, whatever it may be. And so you're working with something that consumers already love. You're not starting from a place that, you know, you have to teach the consumer that they already enjoy this trend. You're just taking it in a new direction. And it also builds on your own brand work. So I think a lot of times when we get in that room to do ideation work with a brand, it's really scary when you have that whiteboard and it's just, you know, create a new thing that's really cool and every consumer wants to eat it. You know, instead, if you're building on the work that you've already done, if there's something on your menu that's already really popular and you're just, you know, infusing it with new foods and flavors, maybe it's something that was popular years ago and you took it off the menu, but, you know, for whatever reason, it was popular during that time. There's probably something you can do to revive that trend. So it builds on that work you already did without having to start from scratch. And it just keeps you creative. I think that's the funnest thing. Like, you know, I mean, when we did the session at the Flavor Experience, when we do any ideation work, it just keeps your, you know, team thinking of, you know, creative activities, creative ways of, you know, infusing ingredients and menu items and products with new ideas. I think it keeps you really nimble and just constantly, you know, rethinking your menu and your product line to keep it fresh. I think it makes you a better team, you know, if you're a trend reviver.
Yeah, I think one thing we've seen too, Mike, is that, you know, years ago, you might think in terms of there being some guardrails about what you can do culinarily. It feels like those are all gone at this point, right? Like, you don't want to do something gross, but you can do basically anything. You can mix things together that aren't supposed to be mixed. You can get pretty wild. It's almost expected at this point.
I mean, and that's when we're doing ideation work, that first round where there's no guardrails, think of anything under the sun. That's where the cool stuff comes from, absolutely. And then, you know, this builds on what you're talking about, Jack, but there is a demand for, you know, new, fresh ideas from consumers, from our industry. So we ask this question every year, and it's always the vast majority of consumers who say that they want to see new foods and flavors and beverages. So 3/4 of consumers at the beginning of this year said that they want to see new food and beverage trends in, you know, 2022. I'm sure we're going to see the same thing in 2023. And it's particularly true from food service. So if we break it down for, you know, do you want them from food service or do you want them at home? It's particularly true, you know, when consumers go out to restaurants.
Yeah, I look at this picture and it makes me crave. I know this is not what it's a picture of, a mochi nut. That thing is so awesome.
Yeah.
I think they're opening a couple up in Florida, so I'm excited about that.
They're growing like crazy. I feel like every food hall has a mochi-nut
It
now.
is so great. Yeah.
And this is a crazy stat. So this came off of some work that Mark and Hui did on new, food experiences for Gen Z. But so we asked this question, why do you want to try, something new? And Gen Z, 51%, so over half of Gen Z said that they will try a new food just because it sounds exciting, versus the 49% who say that they'll only try it if they think it tastes good. So more of Gen Z says they'll try it just because it's new, and it doesn't even have to taste good. It doesn't even have to seem like something that's tasty. So you can see, how, novelty is just so important, particularly to younger generations.
Yeah, and we've tracked this a stat similar to this over time, which is, if you're going to try something new, is it because you think it's gonna have to taste good, or because it's new and exciting, or it's sort of new for new's sake? And if you imagine like those as two different lines, and the x-axis are the different generations, you get like an effect like this where you have lines that intersect.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
where boomers
exactly,
are with each successive generation, they're more and more likely to say, "I'll try it just because it's new. I don't even have to know if it's going to taste good."
So how do you do it? How do you take these trends that are, maybe dying or declining or just kind of stale at this point, and infuse them with, some new life? So there's a few things. This is, not the full presentation. So these are just a couple of examples of what you can do. But I think, on the next slide here, kind of the top thing, and these are kind of part and parcel of each other, are, just infusing it with fresh trends in general. And there's kind of two ways to do this. Number one is just swapping out an ingredient. So, taking an ingredient that already exists in the item and, infusing a new ingredient into it. So that's the next slide, actually. And so, just look at what the item is, pick out that one ingredient that maybe has an easy swap. And the easiest way to swap is just swapping like for like. So if there's a fruit in the item, what's something from earlier in the menu adoption cycle in, the fruit category that you can swap into it. This, the cocktail industry does this so well. Most new cocktails are just iterations on cocktails that already exist and swapping that sweet flavor for a new sweet flavor. But you can do that for anything on the menu. So the next slide here is a menu adoption cycle for pizza. So you can see in the ubiquity stage for pizza, it's the things that we know and we love, pepperoni, mozzarella, things that are very familiar on pizzas. So take, those proteins, take those cheeses and go earlier in that menu adoption cycle and switch out that new cheese. So, maybe a Taleggio, obviously would create a really new, interesting pizza variety for you. So this is an example where I say, if you have access to our menu adoption cycles and, you're doing some new ideation work, this is the easiest way. Just look earlier in the menu adoption cycle.
Yeah, there's a little side comment. One of the things that we found is if you're going to do something, you should be doing something interesting with your menu items, but the really unfamiliar stuff, like the stuff in the really early stages that maybe people don't know very well, you probably want to tuck that more away in the description of the item than in the name of the item, right? Because people need to be able to still react and know instantly what it is and not be confused by it. But then when they dig into the description, like, ooh, it's more interesting in some way, but they still know precisely what the item is. Like I don't know what some of the items are. Like what is Castel? What is that weird olive? I've
The
never heard of that before.
Castelvetrano olive, which is a particular variety of olive, my least favorite food of all time.
Okay, we'll talk about that later. Cuisines.
And, exploring whatever the item is, the menu item or the product through different cuisines. So, we've talked a few times about some of the Indian pizza operators that are opening across the country. But, what would this item look like if it was, offered through the lens of a different cuisine? So, we've kind of tested some of these butter chicken pizzas and tikka masala pizzas, and they do really well with consumers. I'm thinking big picture. So, don't just think about the ingredients, but what are some of the big picture factors that are impacting it that maybe you can kind of play off of? I think a good example of this is the next one. We saw those unicorn toasts that were being offered on menus, for a few months there. This is definitely, I don't think, a trend that is perceived as necessarily cool anymore. But the larger trend is that, people wanted things that look really cool for social media, which is still a relevant trend. So, maybe that's the trend that you're actually going to play off of. Play with prep methods, really easy one. Maybe if it's something that's fried, can you bake it or vice versa? Actually, vice versa, frying something that is not traditionally fried, you're going to increase those, purchase intent scores with consumers. Playing with format, can you put it in a pocket, make it bigger, make it smaller? We've done a lot of work around this. Consumers really love when things that are shrunk or made really big. It feels really cool and interesting to consumers. So kind of an easy one to do. I guess just the overall lesson here is interrogate every single aspect of that food, or menu item or product or whatever it may be, pull it apart and then put it back together in a new way. So I want to showcase an example of, what one group in the breakout session did. So we actually offered up envelopes that had declining trends, in them with a bunch of information about that category. So every single one had been in decline for the past decade. So the one that this group got was apple martinis. And you can see the trend line here. In 2012, apple martinis were on 14% of menus, and today they're on 4% of menus. So it's kind of one of those 90s trends that was, at the time really cool. Those apple-tinis. And, for a multitude of reasons, they're not necessarily perceived as cool anymore. So each group was tasked with, freshening up these trends. They looked at maps, they looked at data, they interrogated every aspect. And every single group did such a good job. I would eat absolutely anything that they came up with. But on the next slide, you can see what this group came up with. So they took that apple martini, and out of that dead trend, they created this new trend, or new item, I guess you would say. And this is the sea salt apple spritzer, which is served in a ball jar with a sea salt caramel rim, sparkling apple cider, and infused vodka. So, I mean, this is, it sounds, we're heading in the fall. It sounds like something you could probably put on the menu right now. I mean, some of the groups have things like grape juice, which is the fastest declining non-alcoholic beverage on menus right now, peas and carrots, meatloaf sandwiches, and they all did a really good idea. That last slide too, the image of it is actually fed into DALL-E, the AI, image generating system. So we actually took the concepts that they came up with and we fed them into that AI generation engine, and then they came up with the photo there. So that is an AI photo. And then the last slide here is we just fed it into Food Studio to see, maybe how it would test, and it tests pretty well. Alcoholic beverages can kind of be polarizing to consumers overall, but if you dive into that moderate appeal there, it's actually on the higher end of moderate. And I think you could even probably do some other swaps in here and create a pretty cool item. But, just some ideas to kind of keep your product line or your menu really fresh.
Yeah, this what's old is new again if you do it the right way. Yeah, good stuff. Holy crap, Mike! With 30 seconds to spare, nice job, and thank you to everyone here. In 2 more weeks, we will see you. We're going to go deeper into some really important trend stuff. So come back in 2 weeks, and more importantly, check out all the great content that's in Report Pro. Many of you have it already. If you don't have it, let us know, and we'll show you how to get set up with it. We're really happy to be here with you, and just wanted to say thank you for all of your attention and support for all this time. But we're just getting started. There's a lot more we have to share. See you in a couple weeks, everybody.